a tree-climbing adult. Until I started working on the sermon, I never really thought about how many married couples can claim that on their very first date, they climb a tree. It's true, Nancy and I climbed the tree on our very first date. We literally went out on a limb together. And at least, I know, they get worse too. And, at least metaphorically, we have gone out on a great many limbs together ever since. But interestingly, I think our first date was the first and the only time that we climbed a tree together. On the first day, we climbed the tree in a way like Zacchaeus in the story did, to see something deer, actually a whole herd of deer. I had taken Nancy out on a nature hike that I'd been on many times before. We both loved the outdoors and I had long since discovered a pond that served as a watering hole for wildlife. And right beside it was a big, solid oak with low, hanging branches that you could climb out onto. And we climbed it, and we sat and held onto that tree and waited in a sort of natural deer blind. And sure enough, a dozen or so deer showed up and enchanted us with the beauty and the grace of creation that they exemplify so well. And as I recall, we sat up in that tree hugging onto it so we wouldn't fall for quite a while admiring the deer. And if truth be told, I was also admiring my dazzling, beautiful dear friend who from that day forward became my girlfriend and then my betrothed and then my wife. And it was a memorable day, one of the best and most blessed that I've ever had, that's for sure. I found deer and a deer and the beginnings of transforming love by climbing a tree to get a better look at a part of the divine and God's wondrous creatures that roam the wooded hills around our hometown of San Jose, California. And I mention all this for a couple of reasons. One is to confirm the rumors that I do indeed have a history of literally being a California tree hugger. And that Nancy and I actually did once find a lot of dough. And have been fawning over each other ever since. We just can't buck it, so to speak. Another more important reason I mentioned my first date in a tree is to point out that from at least my perspective, it's not all that far-fetched for an adult to climb a tree, to get a view of something dear, like a part of God's creation. Or in the case of Zacchaeus, God in Christ Jesus. In a sense, both my story and the one we heard today from Luke are about an adult going out on a limb for love. Mine for romantic love. Zacchaeus was, as it turned out, for Christ's love. Zacchaeus, the text tells us, was short in stature. And the Bible, to my never-ending delight, is full of inside jokes and puns. And we can actually hear this short stuff as a bit of word play, punning. Zacchaeus is physically short, but he also falls short of proper living. He may be big in stature when it comes to earthly power's way of the pursuit of material wealth, but he comes up far short of stature in heavenly ways pursuit of justice and kindness and humble walks with God. And so we need to hear Zacchaeus as being both literally short as well as morally short. The big man to earthly power is a small man physically and morally. And the gospel writer sets up this clever and funny dissonance of the big being small and the rich in money being poor in what matters. And there's some funny dissonance working in other directions as well. Zacchaeus is ironically humbled by Christ's presence. Rich men, big men in the community are not supposed to stoop so low as to climb a tree, especially to see a homeless peasant rabbi like Jesus. But Zacchaeus does just that. And Jesus' ministry is so powerful, it can drive important men up a tree in more ways than one. And as it turns out in this story, it's a very good way indeed. Christ can cause anyone who wants to experience love to defy cultural mores, if need be. See, the reverse is also true. A peasant rabbi is not supposed to associate with, let alone break bread with, a tax collector, and a chief tax collector at that. Why? Because tax collecting was a loathsome profession in Palestine. It was loathsome because tax collectors were local Jewish men who were considered, and I think rightfully so, to have betrayed the community by ruthlessly collecting money for the occupying Roman oppressors, and it was collected from their own people, most of whom were very, very poor. Tax collectors not only collected the tax, but added a hefty commission for themselves. And chief tax collectors, well, they not only collected taxes and oversaw the other tax collectors, but they got a cut from everybody as well. And that's why Zacchaeus is rich, yet short of stature in his community. As chief tax collector, he's the lowest of the low to the locals. And you probably could not find a person more low in that culture and time and place. And if we think of the types of people that we are taught in our own culture to loathe, those are the type of people that Zacchaeus represents in the lectionary reading that Cliff read so well. And Jesus does not just find this loathed person, he hunts him down. Jesus aggressively goes out of his way to get to Zacchaeus. And he walks over to where he is, and he literally looks up a tree to find him. And when he finds him, Jesus doesn't judge him. He invites him and welcomes him to break bread. It's a topsy-turvy story. Jesus, the peasant rabbi, and Zacchaeus, the wealthy tax collector, are not acting as earthly ways dictate they should act. They are both denying cultural boundaries. And frankly, we like them both for it. Their actions are what we desire to happen, what we root for. We want the wrongdoers to make good. We want the outcast to be invited in and welcome. We want Christ to love sinners. It does our heart good to hear it, because it means that love can triumph over the worst of the worst. It means that no matter who we are or what we have done or where we are on life's journey, we are not only welcome, we are not only invited, but we are loved and we are cared for by Christ just as we are. It means love wins. And Jesus and Zacchaeus make a happy union come about by not acting the way earthly rules dictate, but rather by acting the way heavenly rules dictate. Love God. Love neighbor. In everything do to others as you would have them do to you. Love wins when we follow Jesus' commandments. That's their purpose. Jesus and Zacchaeus do their heavenly part for love's victory in the story. And sadly, the ones who are acting their earthly parts are everyone else in the crowd. The disciples and Jesus' religious opponents are in one accord at being appalled at the boundary busting that they are witnessing Zacchaeus and Jesus doing. The crowd's uniformly upset those who are taking down socially constructed norms. The rich and the poor are talking. Outcasts are being cared for. The loathsome are recruited, and they become the lovesome. This makes Jesus, and especially Zacchaeus, very happy. But it makes the crowd grumble. We are told all of them grumble. And this is sad on a number of levels, not the least of which is that despite this story and its message being from Jesus himself and in the gospel for over 2,000 years, we, the crowd, have yet to usually do as Jesus does in the story. The crowd's actions toward the loathe are not what God desires. They're not what Jesus desires. They're not what we desire to happen. It's not what we applaud in the story. Crowds, including church crowds, rarely, if ever, hunt down and recruit cultural outcasts like Jesus does and taught us over and over and over again to do. The Bible tells us to be like Jesus. But as a rule, we still grumble at Jesus' idea of transforming those that we find loathsome, into those that we find lovesome. And most crowds of Jesus followers still want to and do grumble at the notion of recruiting into the community those the culture finds loathsome. Right? We hear it every day in the media. Most people, including many Christians' tendency leaning is to act like that crowd. Accepting the status quo is easier. It rocks the boat far less. And it's not like the crowd just stood by idly in the story either. The community didn't lift Zacchaeus up or make a way for him to get to Christ. The crowd did not act to help Zacchaeus overcome his physical shortness or his metaphoric shortcomings as he tried to get to and see and experience Christ. Actually, the crowd got in Zacchaeus' way. That's why he has to climb a tree. Jesus' followers are an impediment to Zacchaeus experiencing Christ. And we can actually understand the crowd to have intentionally blocked his view of Christ. The story in good part then is about Jesus' followers deliberately denying a culturally loathed person access to Jesus. And we can hear this as both a physical reality and a metaphoric truth suggested by all the grumbling. The ugly truth is that no one in the crowd thought Zacchaeus had any right whatsoever to experience Christ's presence. He was to all, save Jesus, an outcast deserving no access to Christ, let alone to God's love. But Zacchaeus inruns their efforts. He climbs a tree and gains some height. At the same time, he gains some sight. He sees the Lord despite his blinding shortcomings and those shortcomings of the community that also deprive him of the sight of the Lord. And by God, if Jesus doesn't inrun their efforts too, he goes over to Zacchaeus and aggressively and openly and affirmatively approaches and helps them in his desire and effort to experience Christ's beautiful, loving, transforming presence. And throughout the Gospels, we see that Jesus has a ministry of reaching out to the culturally low. There are no bounds to his love. And his unconditional love is reflected in a wonderful, wonderful meal ministry. Jesus goes out of his way to break bread with any type of person, rich and poor, men and women, old and young, sick and healthy, free and slave, Jews and Gentiles, loved and loathed. And in today's lectionary reading, no one can believe that Jesus is willing to extend his lovesome meal ministry to the loathsome likes of Zacchaeus. Everyone except Jesus wanted to deny Zacchaeus Christ's love and access to that meal ministry. But Jesus' love, God's love, is unconditional. Unconditional. Everyone gets it. Everyone gets Jesus' love. We can see how it makes a difference in the story. Zacchaeus accepts that love and he is happy and he is transformed. And the happiness of his transformation leads to his using his blessings for the benefit of many. He gives to the poor. He makes restitution for the wrongs that he's committed. More lives are transformed. Love triumphs. Love wins. And the story is not about beliefs, but about action. Zacchaeus puts love into action, just as Jesus did, and it matters. The Feasting on the Word commentary puts it like this: Zacchaeus' salvation lies in his good deeds and his eagerness to amend his life. Following Jesus is not about getting the nuances of religious doctrine down this way or that. It's about getting the actions of love working in our life for others and for ourselves. To paraphrase Jesus' two supreme commandments, it's about loving others as you love yourself. It's about loving God in all of creation. I mentioned in our informal discussion in July that boiled down Christianity is about believing in God. It's about God being love. And it's about our loving love and being love. And it's those last two things that Jesus mentions in his two supreme commandments. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. Love and be love. And I'm here as your pastor in this church because this church, out of many other churches, I might add, leapt out to me and to my wife Nancy as a community that places a premium on loving love and being love. This is a doing and acting as Christ's hands and feet in the world church, and I am deeply honored and blessed to have been called to continue such an awesome ministry with you. And I love that we're having communion this first Sunday, and I love that the communion table that we're about to celebrate this morning is about loving love and being love. To be sure, it's about remembering Jesus' body was broken and his blood was spilled for the salvation of the world. And notice, not just salvation for us or those like us, but salvation for all, for absolutely everybody. And most especially, this table is for those deemed loathsome for whatever reason by earthly standards. Think of whoever it is in our culture that teaches that we're taught to loathe, whether we like it or not. Christ, God incarnate here and now, always loves them unconditionally. Jesus is teaching his followers in today's story to not just welcome, but to aggressively find and invite and to love them unconditionally too, whether they be found down the block or in the pew next to you or next door or in our family or up in a tree. The communion table remembers Jesus' sacrifice, but he left it for us to not only remember his actions, but to call us to do such actions too, to remember and to reenact, to remember and to reenact, to welcome and invite and embrace without regard to culturally constructed bars or biases or boundaries. There are none at Jesus' table, none in his community. Everyone and anyone, even the low Zacchaeuses of the world, are to be found and invited and welcomed to Christ's table and to Christ's community. We are not to block their access. Indeed, we are to work to make a way for it and encourage it and help it. And in the days and the months and the years, and I pray years and years ahead together, may we work in this ministry to continue to make such a way and encourage it for all the sinners and saints we are blessed to encounter at church, at work, at home, and everywhere else. May we continue to have the courage to not just welcome, but to actively invite friends and families and co-workers and strangers to experience the unconditional love of God without impediments, without having to climb a tree physically or metaphorically. And may we help lift up, build up others so that they can see and experience Christ. May it be so. Amen.